So one of the things I most love about my garden are all of the insects. Mostly I like the beneficials, of course, like the bees and the butterflies, and I try to attract these by planting a lot of flowers. However, I also have a lot of bad insects in my garden, and today I'd like to share with you 5 of them. We'll take a look at aphids, the squash beetle, scale insects, of course, that nasty little cabbage worm that a lot of us have had problems with in the garden. And lastly, the flea beetle. So what we'll take a look at are signs of infestation, so that when you're walking through your garden, you can be looking for these signs that I'll show you. You should take a few minutes every day to walk through your garden. And then I'll show you how to identify the insect, and then how to get rid of them from your garden. Anything that we do not want in the garden is considered a pest, so we want to get rid of the pest and not the good insects. So we'll take a look at some of the different pesticides. To keep this simple, I tried to break it down into 2 categories. Basically, most of your pesticides are either going to be a topical application or systemic. Now, systemic pesticides are widely used, but mostly for conventional farming, so I'm not really going to focus on those. The most popular systemic pesticide is the Neonicotinoid family. There are multiple of them, and what it is just something that is put on the plant that is inside the plant. So a systemic pesticide is usually sprinkled around the soil, or either it is sprayed onto the plant, and then the plant takes it in, usually through the root system and up through the plant tissue, or it'll take it in through the leaves of the plant. And that way this insecticide is inside the plant and it will kill feeding insects. So most all of our vegetables here in the US, unless you're buying organic, are grown with this pesticide. So it's actually inside the food and it cannot be washed off. Now I'll cover this a little bit more at the end of the video, but I basically just wanted to touch on that. I want to focus mostly on pesticides for the home gardener. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at topical pesticides, and those are usually applied and work through either contact or ingestion. A contact pesticide basically just means you have to hit that insect with that pesticide for it to work. An ingestion pesticide means that that insect has to eat it for it to work. So just because something is labeled a pesticide does not mean that it is a chemical. There are natural organic pesticides that are contact and ingestion. There are also synthetic chemical pesticides which work through contact and ingestion. So I will show you options for both so that you can adapt it to your gardening practices. As always, you need to make sure you're reading your pesticide labels very thoroughly. Make sure that they are approved for use on the vegetable or the plant that you're using it on, and that is extremely important. So the synthetic pesticide that I will refer to throughout the video most commonly will be Carpel Rule, and that is on the market under the brand name of 7. It is approved to be used on over 100 crops in the US, but it is illegal to use it in many countries. I would also like to note that the EPA has classified Carpel Rule as a likely human carcinogen. So you need to make sure to use this with caution if you decide to use this synthetic chemical, which works, but it needs to be used according to the label directions. I have used this before, but I made sure not to get it into my soil. My understanding is that it can be taken up by the roots and move into the areas of active growth within a plant. So let's go ahead and get started here. So the first bad bug that we'll take a look at is called the flea beetle. Now this little beetle looks just like a little flea, and he hops around like a little flea, and you'll first notice signs of infestation by little pinpoint holes in your leaves, and then if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that little black bug. As a matter of fact, if you disturb your plant and you have a bad infestation, you'll hear them just popping around. They're tiny and shiny. They have like a little metallic appearance, looking kind of bluish, grayish. You most likely will find these in the springtime. They love cabbage and potato leaves. They like radish tops. They are known for transmitting a lot of different viral and bacterial diseases, including early blight to potatoes. A lot of people will plant radishes as a trap crop. So a lot of your pesticides will come in different forms. They'll come in either a spray form, some powder, or granules. I tend to use the spray forms. So I have used spinosad to keep those flea beetles under control on my cabbages and on my potatoes. Spinosad is a topical pesticide which you spray it on your plant, and when the insect feeds on your plant, it will kill the insect. And it has a little bit of systemic activity, but it's local and it's where you sprayed it on the leaf. Now all of the pesticides I'm going over with you will have instructions on their labels as to how long you need to wait before you harvest. So make sure again, and I'll probably say it 2 or 3 more times, that you are reading that label, because these pesticides also, they will break down over time through sunlight, rainfall, and it will also tell you at what time you need to reapply, because one time of application is not going to keep an infestation under control. You may knock out some of the adult feeding insects, but you remember you also have some eggs under there too, most likely, and so those will be emerging, and then you will never really completely get rid of the infestation. So make sure you're following the application instructions. I usually have to apply different pesticides at least 2 to 3 times. Now the synthetic alternative is Carpel Rule. So that's a contact. They will die upon getting hit with that. It's effective, but it's highly toxic. So I'm going to show you other things that you can use here, such as spinosad, that is not near as toxic and breaks down much faster in the environment. So as I mentioned, I like to use a spray form of most of the organic pesticides that I use, mostly because I interplant. I typically will not have all of my cabbages in one area. I'll put maybe some kale next to some green beans, buy some tomatoes. My herb garden, of course, has oregano, thyme, and sage all mixed in together. So for this reason, I like to treat only the plant that has the problem. I do not do any kind of broad spray across my garden. So I like to use these professional little spray bottles. They're easy to find at Walmart. I'll leave links below the video if you'd like to check it out. They have a great little measuring tool on the side. They have a good labeling area. But what's most important about this bottle is that you can spray it upside down, which is very important for applying pesticides. Most of your pests, the insects that you do not want in your garden, are living underneath your leaves. It's very seldom you'll see them on top. So whatever you're using, if you want to use a big sprayer, you go ahead and do that, because that gets up underneath those leaves very easily. However, I like to mix my solutions fresh, and I don't really need to, I don't have a farm or anything, so I don't really need to mix a big jug of pesticide. I just spot treat little areas if it needs treatment. So I buy my pesticides in a concentrated form, so then I can just mix it as I need it. But this is a very popular one that is available at most of the home improvement stores, and this is also spinosad, but it's already mixed for you. Whenever I use spinosad, I do not apply it to any plants that are in flower. Again, it's easier for me to control my spray with a small bottle, but I do not put this on flowers because it can harm bees. So you don't want to put it on anything that a bee may visit. So here are some other brands of spinosad that you can look up on the internet. Maybe they're on Amazon. If you wanted to order some, these were recommended by Clemson University. Now, another problem that I've had is something called scale, and I had this on a citrus tree. And those little things are just terrible. They look like little bumps that are just stuck to your bark and your leaves of a tree or whatever plant it is that you have. Now, a way that you might notice that you have them is you may notice that ladybugs are visiting your plant, and they like to eat scale. So if you see ladybugs, then you may want to go ahead and take a closer look and see if you see scales on your plant. You'll also look for aphids, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I tried a lot of different methods of getting rid of them over the years, but since they were on my citrus tree, this tree was inside my house most of the year. I'd say 6.5 months out of the year. And they don't fly around or anything. They just kind of stay on the tree. But I really couldn't treat them because they were inside my house. And I didn't really have much of a problem with them when my tree was outside. But finally, I gave up on these things. I think you're supposed to use horticultural oil to really get rid of them. But I didn't. I was just fed up with them. So as I mentioned, you can use horticultural oil to keep them under control, or neem oil. Basically, all these oils do is they suffocate that scale and then they die. You can also use insecticidal soap for soft scale. You have two kinds of scale. You'll have armored scale, so it has a little bit more of a protection, and then you have soft scale. But for me, this was the one time that I used Carpel Rule to get rid of my problems. I'd had the tree 9 years. I've been fighting scale almost the entire time. So here are some insecticidal soaps that you could use. These are the brand names. So you can just pause this if you need to look for them on the internet. There's also some horticultural oil, which has been recommended too by Clemson University. And neem oil, I want to mention too, is different than neem seed extract, which we'll look at here in just a bit. So I mentioned that I used 7 on my tree, and I did not want it to get into the soil, so I wrapped the base in plastic, and then I used a spray hose, and I just almost pressure washed that poor tree, and it just really killed the scale. I rinsed all the 7 off. I reapplied it again later, and then I rinsed that off after about a day, and lo and behold, it worked beautifully. And I had a nice, lovely tree within just a few months. I was so happy. Now, another insect is called the squash beetle. This little beetle looks a lot like a ladybug, and for a long time, I collected these in a wide-mouth jar. These are mostly found in the eastern United States. They will feed on squash plants and cucumber plants. And the signs that you may have them before you actually see the beetle is that there will be holes in your leaves. They will look kind of skeletonized. The little veins will still be there on the leaf, but there will be holes, and usually they are up underneath there. Now on a shady day, they might be there on top. And I can look at this and know this is not a beneficial lady beetle because it does not have white cheeks that you will find on the lady beetles that eat aphids, such as this one. So it's white on the end, and I know that one is not a bad bug. Though some people consider the Asian lady beetle to be a bad bug because they will invade your home in the winter time. But I've never had a problem with them. Most of the times, if you see that your plant's not doing well and it's covered up with lady beetles, you might think at first that's why your plant is not doing well, but actually they are there feeding on something that's on that plant, which is not good for your plant, most likely scale. A lot of times large trees can be infested with lady beetles, but the actual damage is coming from scale insects, which they are eating. And this here is a larva of the squash beetle. So those oftentimes will be up underneath your leaves as well. So here are a couple of options to control the squash beetle in your garden. And the first one here is a natural one which works through ingestion, so you have to spray it on those leaves, and it's neem extract. Now neem seed extract is different than neem oil. The neem oil a lot of times does not have seed extract in it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. and you can mix this yourself. I'll give you some recommendations here in just a bit. Now another one that's natural and works through contact is pyrethrin. Now a lot of times pyrethrin, it will just paralyze the insect, and sometimes they can recover from that, and so you don't actually kill them. But when you use it in conjunction with another pesticide, then you can expect good results with that. And I'll give you some recommendations for those here too. And then of course the synthetic contact pesticide would be Carpel Rule. And one thing I'd like to point out is that when you use neem seed extract, it will harm bees, so be careful when you're applying it to your plants to make sure you're not putting it on any flowers in your garden. There was a study I ran across where they compared how toxic it was to bees. So I'll leave information below the video if you'd like to check those out. The neem oil that was used in the study did contain neem seed extract. So I'll leave some different brands here for you for the pyrethrin combination and the neem seed extract. So now let's take a look at cabbage worms. You might first notice that you're having a problem because your kale or your broccoli, your cabbages, well, they have holes in the leaves. They might have big ragged holes right there in the leaf. And then if you step back and you take a look around your garden, well, you might just notice little white butterflies flying around. Well, those little white butterflies are laying their eggs on your plants. So when those eggs hatch, out pop those little worms, and they will just start feeding on your plants. Oftentimes you will find them up underneath your leaves. However, when I've had a bad infestation, they are also on the top. And then there's the cabbage moth. Now this little moth will lay eggs too, and its worm looks different. The white butterfly worm is green, and this is called a cross-striped cabbage worm. It looks quite different than the solid green one. But regardless of what kind you're having a problem with, you can use BT to keep them under control, and that's the natural organic method. Of course, the Carpel Rule will also work. So I use BT instead of spinosad for worms because BT is not toxic to other insects except for the worms that come from moths or butterflies. So for that reason, I don't use spinosad, just to keep it simple. As I mentioned, spinosad can kill other insects. And here are some options for BT that you can pause and take a look at. You want to make sure you're not buying BTI. That is toxic to other insects. What you want is BTK, and it will usually be advertised as a worm control. Now the last bad bug, and probably the worst that everyone has a problem with, are aphids. And you may first notice that you have a problem because your plants shrivel up. The new growth just kind of shrivels up and the plant stops growing. And then you may also look around at your plants and notice lady beetles. Well, they are eating those aphids that are most likely up underneath your leaves. And so here's an example where I had lady beetles on my parsley plant, and I knew these were lady beetles because they had the little white cheeks. If you notice, they look a lot like the squash beetle I showed you earlier, but the head is different. So when I took a look up underneath the plant, there were the black aphids. A lot of times we refer to these also as black fly. So keep that in mind. If you see little lady beetles crawling all over your plant, you most likely have a little aphid infestation brewing right there underneath the leaves. Aphids are very tiny. They're usually under about 1/4 of an inch long, and they come in just about any color. They can be green, golden, white, red, brown, gray, or black. So if you're having a problem with your aphids, a lot of times if you plant nasturtiums, that will attract them so you can get them off of the plant that you're growing that you want to eat. So I usually plant nasturtiums in a lot of different places because I like to use it too. But if I'm getting rid of aphids on, let's say, like my green onions or basil or something like that, I'll plant nasturtiums, and the nasturtium will attract them. And then they'll stay off the plant that I want to eat. I've had them on my scallions before, and I saw a lot of ants running around protecting the aphids. I did a video for you on ants and why you may have them in your garden, and a lot of times it's just to protect the aphids from the beneficial insects like lady beetles and wasps. If you see a little wasp flying around your garden, maybe underneath your leaves of your kale, or right there on top of your bolting broccoli, I purposely let this broccoli go to flower, and I left the aphid infestation on this broccoli plant so that I could observe the behavior of the different insects in my garden. And this is called the Aphidious wasp. It's a little tiny parasitic wasp that needs aphids in order to reproduce. So she basically will just fly around and look for an aphid. Once she's found one that she wants to lay her egg in, she'll lay that egg right inside the aphid. And so here she is laying the egg, and I'll show it to you again in slow motion. Okay. Now the female will lay about 100 eggs inside aphids, but they will also attack about 200 to 300 aphids in the process. So they are always working. On average, about 40% of the eggs are usually male and about 60% are female. Now, once the aphid has become parasitized, it will turn into what's referred to as a little mummy, and it looks like a little brown ball that's stuck to the plant. Here's an example of two. Now from that little mummy will emerge another little parasitic wasp, and it will actually eat that aphid from the inside out for protein to get its life started. This is one reason I don't like to spray spinosad or neem extract on aphids, because if you have parasitic wasps visiting those aphids and they are creating little mummies there, remember that that emerging parasitic wasp is going to eat that mummy. And if it has the neem seed oil on there or the spinosad, you're going to destroy your growing population of parasitic wasps in your garden. And then there's also hoverflies. Now the hoverfly also likes to lay its eggs in an active aphid population, and it will actually lay its egg inside the plant tissue and not inside the aphid. So here's an example of one. They look like little tiny bees, and so she just laid her egg inside this broccoli plant. And then sometimes I will also see them around my peas, and that means that I probably have aphids on the pea. So the little parasitic wasp and the hoverflies, well, you'll oftentimes see them before your aphid infestation gets out of hand if you have a good population of them in your garden to start with. So this is one reason why I also do a controlled spray, and I only spray where there is a problem. I don't do a preventative spray and just start spraying things when I don't have a problem. Sometimes I've noticed a little blemish maybe on a sugar snap pea, and if I've had a problem with aphids, sometimes that might be that the hoverfly laid its egg in the sugar snap pea. So from that plant tissue, a little maggot will emerge, and it eats aphids. It needs aphids to get its life started. And when I was recording a lot of this footage, I also had chamomile growing in the garden, and the hoverfly and the parasitic wasps, they just loved the chamomile. I would always see them on top of the flowers. So grow some chamomile to keep them in your garden once they have taken care of your aphid problem. That'll be their little reward. So here are just a couple of preventative measures you can do to keep the aphids from being attracted to your garden. Don't use fertilizers which are high in nitrogen. They cause rapid new growth, which the aphids love. So a lot of those little water-soluble quick fertilizers that you can get at the home improvement store, well, they are loaded with nitrogen. I like to use those sometimes for my container gardening. So if you're having a problem with aphids, find another way to fertilize your plants. I recommend using a high quality blended compost. So use a lot of different kind of compost and just build your soil. If you build your soil, as mentioned in the All New Square Foot Gardening book, then you should not even need to use fertilizers because all of your nutrients will be in your soil. But keep in mind too that as the temperatures heat up, aphid activity will start to diminish because they prefer those warm and cool temperatures. They don't like the hot summer heat. So I'm going to show you some things you can use to get the aphids under control, but always follow the label instructions of whatever pesticide it is that you're using, as I already mentioned earlier. Now what I use is Insecticidal Soap, and I get the commercial Insecticidal Soap because it has the active ingredient that you need in there without all of the other harsh chemicals in it. So I recommend getting a commercial insecticidal soap and don't try to make your own. That's just my personal recommendation. But I will spray my leaves underneath, but I make sure that I get up underneath there and I let it dry. I try to do this on a dry day when there's no rain in the forecast, because what we want to do is dry out those aphids. The insecticidal soap will dehydrate them, and then usually the next day I will rinse them off with water, and then I let them dry again, and I'll check them in about 2 more days to see if I have any more activity on the plant. If I see it again, I repeat the same process until they're gone. I might have to do this 2, 3, 4 times, but it's a very low toxic way of getting rid of the aphids. So I'll rinse them off with a nice stream of water from a hose, or if it's a young plant, maybe one of my new seedlings, I will do that in my sink. They wash off very easily. So here are a couple of things you can use to get rid of those aphids. As I mentioned, I use commercial insecticidal soap. Another natural contact pesticide is neem oil, and that will basically just suffocate those aphids. And then of course the synthetic would be Carpel Rule. So here are the natural pesticides that I use for my organic garden. I've tried other things too, particularly a product called DE, which is quite effective for soft-bodied insects. However, it's very hard to get that up underneath your leaves. That's where you need to apply DE for it to be effective. So I don't really use that unless I can put it maybe just on some scallions or something where it will stick to that and I don't have leaves to contend with. So I mentioned systemic pesticides at the beginning of the video, and just so you know, this is just a commonly used pesticides to grow just about any kind of vegetable that you're buying at the grocery store. And I stumbled on a study that was done in 2015 with the Harvard School of Public Health and Pesticide Research Institute. The study was quite interesting because they took a sample of food from the Congressional dining hall, and I think it was about 66 different items on 2 different occasions. And from those samples, 91% of the vegetables contained neonicotinoid residues. Many times the seed is actually treated with the nicotinoid, and this will protect the plant from insects for the life of the plant, from the seedling stage all the way to harvest. That pesticide is inside the plant tissue, and as we can see, this study showed that there are still residues of the nicotinoids when they get to the table. Sometimes there are up to 5 different nicotinoids in one plant. So I also would like to note that none of the levels of the neonicotinoid residues exceeded the dose that the EPA considers acceptable. So systemics are used a lot even by consumers for different types of treatments. Even many of you may have a pet and you may have been given some flea and tick control by your veterinarian. Well, a lot of times if it's an oral ingestion, and it usually is systemic. So it's not like this is a terrible thing. However, you do have a choice. So for me personally, when it comes to my food, I like to grow organically with a limited use of pesticides. I like to have a garden that I can visit and just pick some fresh produce, take it inside my home, and feel comfortable about feeding it to my family. I am thankful that we have an abundance of food in this country, that I can go to the store and buy vegetables if I need to. However, we do have a choice when it comes to buying conventionally grown or organic. So the choice is yours. I just wanted to put this out there so that you can also educate yourself a little bit more if you're not familiar with it. And I'll leave a lot of different references below the video if you'd like to check them out. So I really appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions, leave them below the video in the comment section. I sure will try to help you. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, and don't forget to click that little bell off to the right of the subscribed button, and it will give you notifications for updates to my channel. Again, thanks so much for watching, and y'all have a beautiful day.